now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Matt Carmichael, Senior Vice President and Editor of What the Future. Matt, you have the floor.
Thanks, Meg, and welcome everybody to our Future of Identity webinar. I'm Matt Carmichael, your host for today. I'm editor of What the Future magazine and head of the Ipsos Trends and Foresight Lab. And today, as I said, we're going to talk about the future of identity. And this is a really cool issue. And the survey we did for this is one of my favorite things yet, as is this other big secret fact that I am about to reveal to you. That's me on the cover. Over this way. I used the Ready Player Me, which we'll talk about later, to make an interoperable avatar of myself. It's pretty true to the original avatar, as you can see. But this one is me too. And this one with a big red beard. And this one. And on this one, I even did a little bit of market research, really bad market research, where I just posted this on a bunch of my social profiles. And I said, hey, folks, how do you think I'd look with face tats and this really cool NFT from Artifact as my fashion? Do you think I could pull this look off in real life? And everyone was pretty much like, nah, dude, no, you could not. And also, if you've ever really want to know what I look like with a big red beard, I can tell you because I have a real world doppelganger in the lead singer from the band Leesa Evans. That's what I'd look like. What do you think? Now, identity in the virtual worlds can be fungible in many ways that our identity in the real world can't, right? So the metaverse opens up all these new opportunities to have different personas in a way that we don't now. But wait, because that's me, like kind of professional me. And that's slightly more whimsical Twitter me. And that's Facebook me with my dad when I was a very small person. Those are all me. And these are all different identities that I use already. So our identities shift, they evolve. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how identities are formed, how identities are shaped, and how our identities are expressed. We'll talk about how that will or won't be different in all of the new 3D virtual worlds that are coming around for us, like the metaverse. And we'll talk about what this means for brands today and tomorrow. I'm going to go off camera for a little bit so we can dive right in. Ready? First, though, I do want to talk about one other bit of identity. There's this guy, Orville Peck. He's a singer, and he performs in a fringed cowboy mask that makes him feel comfortable in this world to have his own secret identity. And that keeps him from having to express this persona. So he's judged by the persona and not judged by who he truly is. And I'm putting truly in air quotes. So identity is this incredible thing. We can have real identities, we can have virtual identities. And today we're going to talk about all of that. So identity is at the forefront of conversations in both positive and negative ways. Identity is used to draw communities together with common interests and values. It's also a complex and culturally dependent philosophical construct. Identity is also being used to group us in ways that are productive and less so. Our political identity is a quick heuristic for deciding if someone is like us or not. It's like wearing a Cubs hat. You'll make friends wherever you go, and probably only enemies in St. Louis. And the flip side of identity is anonymity, which has increasing value and scarcity in today's data-driven digital world, where we can be uniquely identified by our face, our fingerprints, our heartbeat, our breath, and our gait. And as we move into more 3D virtual spaces, how will we craft and express our avatar identities? And how many will we craft? I was just scratching the surface with mine. Underlying all of this discussion, of course, is a central question for us to consider. How do we, as marketers and researchers, use what we know of identity, and to what extent? Ponder on, dear listener. We're going to start by showing you a little behind the scenes work about how we think about the future when we put together an issue of What the Future. The future of identity will be driven a lot by macro trends coming from different directions. We'll map them all out. Then we'll talk about what the world looks like today and tomorrow in each of those areas of the map. We call this section the lay of the land. And here we'll start to layer in all our data from our identity survey, and you'll hear from all of the smart people we talk to, experts and inventors, about different components and facets of identity. As always, we keep humans at the center of our foresight work. One way we do that in What the Future is by thinking about the tensions people feel about this issue. You're seeing some of those play out in the news every day in real time. Then we'll spin out some plausible ports that our journey into the future will stop into. These mini scenarios aren't a final destination, but are a place where we could stop along the way in the next several years. How will we know which future we're headed toward? For that, we'll go over how we think about shifts in the tensions as waypoints that might show us which port we're navigating to. Sound good? Then here we go. But first, a quick detour into how Ipsos thinks about change. When Ipsos thinks about change, we're thinking about the interplay of three things. First is the macro forces, the big tectonic plates that really drive change. These are things like climate change, demographics, and other changes that play out over time. Really, for the most part, things like our values don't really fundamentally change all that much. On the right are the signals of what is changing. These are things we can observe, like a new patent being filed or some sort of scientific breakthrough, things that are actually happening today. We might not know what it means for the future, but our spidey sense tells us it means something. And in the middle, at the heart of it all, are shifts in people, markets, and society. In other words, at the center of all we do is humans. How will changes be driven by and impact the people? And even when we put something like identity at the center of our map, we're thinking about what changes in the space, or lack thereof, mean for people, markets, and society. But we want to think broadly about those macro forces too, and collect the signals that suggest how things might change over time. Looking at our map, we see 6 key areas that will shape and be shaped by the future of identity. We think about societal changes. We think about political changes, including generational shifts and the changes in where we live. We think about demographic changes and expressions in careers and structures. We think about all the technological changes, and here's where we'll talk a lot about the metaverse. We think about security, about how our identity is used to grant us access to or restrict us from different kinds of things. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the media and talk about how it shows our identity, how it expresses our identity, and how it shapes our identity as well. As I said, when we think about the future of a topic, we like to do so broadly and bring in as wide array of voices as we can. Because believe it or not, the future will not be entirely shaped by brands, marketers, and researchers. So we begin our conversation with someone who has spent her career helping shape people's visual identities, costume designer and stylist, Leesa Evans. You've seen her work in countless movies, including Bridesmaids and Zoolander 2, and TV shows like Young Rock. She believes clothing is a tool for confidence and well-being, and she hopes for a future where we will use fashion to feel confident and authentic. She says that fashion can, and in movies almost must, act as a quick shortcut to some basics of our identity. She uses fashion to help characters express an array of things about their backgrounds and personalities from the moment they walk on screen, or to signal that something has changed from scene to scene. But she notes that we're doing that subconsciously in our real lives as well. This is one of the themes that underlies the movie The Breakfast Club, that we see each of the characters, quote, in the simplest terms and the most convenient definitions. And as in The Breakfast Club, or as Sesame Street taught us, that's only the surface. But the idea lingers in meme culture today. You probably have a meme like this from The Breakfast Club with your neighborhoods, where you live, or the schools you went to, etc. In our Ipsos identity survey, we pushed the sample to 3,000 people so we could split and ask people to both rate and rank how they form and express their identities and how they are shaped externally. That process led to some striation, which we can form into a version of Maslow's pyramid. Some things are foundations, some shows somewhat less important. So here's the first pyramid about how we express ourselves. Far and away the most foundational, the bottom of our pyramid, is how you treat others. It was the most foundational way we express our identity. Next come the choices we make, who we spend time with, where we live, how we vote. Then the more surface expressions like fashion and our possessions and our collections. And finally, the very outer expression like cosmetics, piercings, and tattoos. So fashion is certainly important to how we see each other, but it's also important to how we see ourselves. Here's what Leesa told Kate MacArthur in their interview.
I think what's most important about clothing and how we dress and our appearance, etc., what's most important about that is that we feel in true alignment with who we are internally and who we present to the world externally. Because when we are authentic that way, it puts to bed things like shame and guilt and feeling like a fraud or being less than, and all of these sort of inner dialogue ideas that we don't need to have in our lives in order to succeed in whichever thing that truly brings us joy and passion.
Our identities have several demographic components that marketers have found traditionally shape consumer needs and how to reach and communicate with discrete audiences. Like clothing and footwear, males will gravitate to purchasing hair care and grooming products that are designed specifically for the male gender, says Christy Click, an Ipsos client officer. She says this is partly driven by their belief that unique needs can only be addressed with gender-specific product formulations. But just as the market is shifting into creating products for underserved groups, the technology is arriving to create products tailored to and personalized for the individual. That's going to give shoppers an entirely new set of tools to express their identity. Fashion can even show one of the most fractured bits of our identities these days, our political identities. Think about how a red baseball cap or a pink knit cap have come to symbolize movements. Social media, and cable news before it, has been accused of helping people isolate themselves in community bubbles of thoughts and ideas. Increasingly, that seems to be happening in our physical world as well. Studies have shown that there are fewer and fewer purple areas in our electoral map, and more deep reds and blues. Journalist Dante Cini analyzes the data and reports on the ground about how our political identities are shaped by and shape our physical landscape. He and I have known each other for quite a while now. His book, The Patchwork Nation, and his county-based socio-political economic typology were an inspiration to a lot of my own research, and ultimately my book. I say this as disclosure, but also to say that Dante has traveled the US and spent some time in all sorts of communities, not just parachuting into the Heartland Diner once every 4 years. In short, he's seen some stuff, and he thinks we're in for a, quote, really bad decade. Cini says that in the 90s, people thought the internet would make the geography irrelevant, but the opposite happened. People today move to communities with amenities they want, including consumer choices like restaurants. Retailers consider demographics when choosing site locations, and even restaurants and stores become more polarized. Physical bubbles mirror our virtual bubbles. Places and politics define us. But he sees glimmers of a different future, where some boundaries become fuzzier and split open in our political and place-based identities. We might even, he thinks, go through a period soon where we wind up with 3 or more political parties. He says, I feel that the parties in the 10 years could look dramatically different. Nationally, party ID is getting stronger. The big cities are more democratic, the urban suburbs are more democratic, and the rural middle America is more Republican. But then you get to all these communities and exurbs, and you start to see the shifts happening in those places. While we do tend to cluster, read the book The Big Sort for more on that. The politics of a place aren't typically one of the top reasons why people choose to move to a place, despite what you might have heard in the media lately. In a given year, very few people move at all any considerable distance, and those that do so are doing so for a different pyramid of reasons. The foundation here, and Ipsos has been running this data since I was the client as editor of livability.com, where this chart originated, is this Maslowian needs like affordability and safety concerns. As I said earlier, our values are very slow to change. Dante sees a world where all decisions politically are being made not just by, does it help me, but even more strongly by, does it help those people? And if it helps those people, we're even less likely to support it. That's leading to our current gridlock, and it's not healthy. And again, our geography plays into that. Here's what he had to say.
You live in a community, you drive through it like, oh, look, it's got that coffee shop I like. I really like that restaurant. Like, this is the place I want to live. Well, increasingly, everybody who says those things lives in the same place. They tend to be the same type of demographic background, same kind of background in terms of educational attainment. And then once they live there, they're talking to people that are like themselves, and actually it just becomes an echo chamber, right? You're just living around people who see the world the way that you do. You shop at the same places, you eat at the same kinds of places. There are fewer things that bind us together as a country. And increasingly, we've broken off into these little geographic niches where we're getting what we need to make us happy. And those little niches and those little different views and those people around, those little bubbles we're in, have different views of reality. And that's becoming incredibly complicated.
Complicated indeed. Identity is becoming one of the most fraught battlegrounds in politics today. Democrats are pushing for conversations about the current and historic dynamics of race, gender, and sexuality in power. Republicans, claiming those conversations are divisive by nature, are passing legislation to ban identity-based conversations in the workplace and school. And yet political identity itself is one of the most significant fault lines in America today. Cliff Young, the US president of Ipsos Public Affairs, says many factors go into how we shape our identity. An exclusive study of how we define ourselves and how we form communities, Ipsos showed that political identity is the strongest shortcut for whether we think someone will be like us or not be like us. Think about my comment earlier about the red hats. Fashion, or however we demonstrate our political identity, tells us a lot in one simple expression. It's like when a Cardinals fan walks into a Cubs bar in Wrigleyville, or a Yankee fan shows up in like any other town, but more so. Because you know not just their team affiliation, or in this case, their political affiliation, you can then surmise a lot of other things about what they watch on TV, what they read, even what fast food they eat or don't. Will technologies like 3D virtual communities and the metaverse lead to more tightly defined bubbles as we sort ourselves into like-minded communities? Or will they allow us to move freely between virtual spaces and connect with people we wouldn't be able to meet in the physical world? That was one initial promise of the internet. Sébastien Bourget, who is building one of the leading decentralized virtual gaming worlds, hopes for the latter. We were lucky to get some time with the co-founder of the Sandbox shortly before I got to meet up with him in person at his South by Southwest party with Paris Hilton on the turntables. And yeah, that was a cheap excuse for that flex. Sorry, but not sorry. That party, as Paris Hilton says, was hot. Anyway, Sandbox is first and foremost a gaming platform, but also increasingly a virtual mall and community. Major brands and marketers like Adidas, Warner Brothers, even Snoop Dogg have all bought virtual real estate there. Individual plots of space have sold for millions. So it would be easy for Sandbox to become an enclave. And since where we live, even virtually one would suspect, and the communities we are part of are important components of our identity, how do you keep it inclusive so that people of all identities are free to participate and express themselves? Sandbox aims to be as diverse as possible, but that takes intentional design of systems, says Bourget. Here's what he told me.
It's a combination of technology and human force. So the first part of technology is having monitoring system and that will monitor action and that will monitor text being exchanged towards applying filters over words, for example, inappropriate. The second thing, when I refer to more of the human labor, is to have community managers that are live with the community and monitoring that everything is be happening within the right boundaries and it's protecting every user. and having also incentive for the community to be part of that monitoring and moderating system, even creating jobs for people to become moderator.
How we create our identity is based on excuse me, a wider range of demographic and psychographic characteristics. The 2020 census showed many demographic characteristics are becoming more fluid. For instance, the number of people identifying as more than one race increased 276% from 2010. Psychographic components are shifting as well. The Ipsos Future of Identity survey showed that 1 in 3 people who ranked religion as a leading factor in their identity ranked it as the top factor. For the much smaller group who listed career occupation as a key component of their identity, more than 4 in 10 said it was one of the top 3 factors. But these institutions are changing too. Religiosity in America has been declining for decades. The number of Americans who hold more than one job has been increasing over the decades as well. As identities morph, so will people's values and social mores. Increasingly, these point to more flexible, even situation-based standards. This could play out in a couple of ways in the digital world, says Huda Masudi, a director at Ipsos. It's certainly plausible that our sense of identity will become more and more fluid, she says, in the future, especially as we can express ourselves in virtual spaces and change that expression frequently with almost no limits. In virtual spaces, we're able to craft digital representation ourselves as avatars. That opens up many questions about the future of identities. One consideration is purely logistic. Do we want to make an avatar for every platform we use? If you think creating unique passwords is a pain, this is much more of a burden. But what if it was seamless? Timmu Toke founded Ready Player Me to solve that by creating an avatar engine that is meant to be portable across platforms. He thinks this will enable us to express ourselves as we want and need to, but with much less work. It was super easy for me to make all those avatars you saw at the beginning, and my outfit with Artifact Fashion, which, by the way, you should check out the Future of Wealth issue for a great interview with Artifact's Benoit Pagado, right before they were acquired by Nike. Toke suggests that we'll have different identities for different purposes. We might choose avatars more like our physical selves for people who know us in person. We might have an avatar for work. We might have an aspirational avatar for dating or gaming worlds, he says. Ultimately, you will likely land on a few different identities, he says. You will use not an infinite amount because you want to create some kind of connection and maybe live out different parts of your own character limits within those identities. Here's what he told me.
Yeah, on one side, you can choose to show your identity or you can choose to be anonymous. I've spoken recently with a bunch of people that build some content creation tools, and they see avatars as a way to lower the barrier for creating content because you don't have to kind of put yourself out there. You can have an avatar representation. It can be like connected with your real life identity. It doesn't have to, and that kind of lowers the barrier for content creation. But I think it's the same with in general kind of social interactions as well. You don't feel like you have to put yourself fully out there. It might be easier to interact.
Seems to be we're having a bit of a technical issue at the moment, so give us just 1 second. We'll see Jack on the line.
All right, we'll talk more about anonymity in a moment, but Toke's notion that how closely our avatars will mirror our actual identities will be based on partly how much that avatar will interact with people who know us in real life. That's a super interesting idea. So here's our second pyramid, this one looking at how we form our identity. The communities we take part in are kind of in the middle of the pyramid, behind some demographic characteristics like gender, parental status, etc. But the foundational aspects are more about who we are mentally based on our life experiences, our psychology, and our religion. There's a ton of complexity in this data as you drill in terms of what is important and for whom. Another example of this that I want to dive into is something that didn't quite fit into the issue itself, which is a discussion of gender identity. In the pyramid, gender was kind of a low-tier, important component of our identity. Everyone rated it as somewhat important, and when forced to rank it, it was stronger for women, but it was notably less strong for younger Americans. I use he, him pronouns, which is something I only ever really thought about in recent years, and it's certainly not something that I ever would have had the ability to put in my LinkedIn profile until really recently, as I do now. We discussed this topic in our Future of Gender issue. But for many younger Americans especially, this is just part of how they think about gender. Fluidity is accepted without any thought. They might say, "This is my friend Alice. She used to be Alexander." Or the kids will refer to their friend as they and politely but firmly correct you if you use the wrong pronouns. I was talking to a teenager I know recently, and she uses she, her pronouns, but doesn't like to dress, quote, like a girl, and doesn't really see gender as a thing in the way previous generations through history have. Her friends change names, change pronouns, change identities, not on a whim or not frequently, but they're all growing into the identity they feel most comfortable in. We then had a conversation about generational effects, and this is the fascinating part for me. And I would hope that for all of us as researchers, that we are considering that as we watch this in real time. We don't have any idea which situation we're in. Is this a cohort effect? Is this something where today's teenagers will have this fluid identity and fluid conception of identity as they move through their lives? Is it a life stage effect where from now on, teenagers and people in their early 20s will have a fluid idea of identity? Or is this maybe a period effect? Is this something that's fundamentally going to be different from now on? We don't know. So we need to keep researching. We need to stay tuned. We need to keep an eye on our waypoints to see which future we're steering towards. Because it's certainly possible that our idea of gender will be any one of these. Tracy Fallows, a futurist and author of Future of You, sees both plausible futures, that identity becomes more and more fluid, or that a need grows to make at least components of it more rigid, because identity, and that flip side of anonymity, are concepts that will evolve in virtual worlds like the metaverse. Already identities are complex to form, hard to define, and increasingly easier to steal and fake. But even the concept and philosophy of identity varies from culture to culture. How will we define ourselves? And what happens to our legacy identities as they drift through time and space? Will we run into various selves from time to time? One key question, of course, is how much of our time we will spend in digital spaces versus physical spaces. Fallows doesn't think the answer is linear. Trends rarely work like that, she says. She says, quote, "I don't see it as this huge, unfettered progress. People will stop doing certain things and decide, oh no, we want much more human contact again. It'll be cyclical, and then it'll come back to doing more socializing and work in the virtual environment. But will tech advances lead to worlds where we can spin up a version of ourselves and role-play different decisions?" Tracy has some thoughts on that potential future as well. Here's what she told me.
But one of the very interesting questions is, how many identities will you have in these sorts of worlds? So you mentioned like the authentic identity. We're used to having one authentic identity in physicality because we're embodied in this physical body, but we won't have that. And so we could have many different identities in the multiverse or metaverse or whatever you call it. And that means that you could end up having meetings with or meeting up with yourselves. And I think that's the most interesting thing, that you can bend time and space so that you don't have to be just one person living a very linear life. One could meet up with different versions of oneself at different ages, life stages. Perhaps you could meet up with your younger self or older self. You know, all of these things could be possible. And that will really give us a completely different sense of reality.
Hopefully at this point, you're starting to see how all this might work in theory. But there are practical considerations as well. How does our identity impact our user experience? For starters, design should consider the wide range of identities and the wide range of expressions and abilities they represent. But beyond that, consider how we might log in or authenticate within apps in the future. Currently, we use passwords or biometrics linked to our physical selves. How will that work in virtual spaces? Jacqueline Hall, a vice president at Ipsos's UX practice, offers one solution. She says, we might see cases where our avatars have to be verified as tied to our physical selves, even if the avatar is expressing another form of our identity. Plausibly, however, we'll have to create a whole new experience of verification, where the combination of ourselves and our avatars have different access rights. Blockchain tech opens potentials for us to have much more granular control over our personal information and identifiers. But decentralization has drawbacks too. How do you appeal something? Will it be too permanent of a record? How do you get the world to agree on one system for verification? Otherwise, identification could be even more complicated than what we have now, says Trevor Sedano, a senior engagement manager in Ipsos Strategy 3. He says, there's a likely scenario where some centralized authority will be needed to verify people's unique digital identities. That raises privacy, security, and monopolistic implications in terms of who controls that database. It's almost too critical to entrust to any one entity. Will we have to anyway, just to make the system function? Media both shapes and reflects our identities, at least for those who see themselves in media at all. Historically, that hasn't always been a positive thing. Stereotypes, biases, complex issues of underrepresentation of some identities have plagued the industry. But there's growing awareness that media should be as diverse as its audience, says Catherine Pieper, who oversees the research and advocacy efforts of the University of Southern California's Annenberg Inclusion Initiative. She co-authored its Inequality in 1300 Popular Films report. Media representation and identity have a tricky relationship. People know when they see themselves on screen, when it's a positive or negative portrayal, and if it's an accurate one. Arguably, that's truer for underrepresented identities. But it's also important to see people who aren't like you, people who might have identities you don't run across in your everyday life, especially as we live in our physical and virtual bubbles. Dr. Pieper says, generally, we talk about media effects as being more powerful in the absence of direct contact. Which brings us to our third pyramid. We like to think that social media isn't a big factor in shaping our identity. Family is so important that it gets the foundational tier all to itself. But in the middle, there's pop culture, there's TV, music, and more. This stuff's important to our understanding of ourselves and others. Being included in the representation is, she says, a low bar, and one we're still not clearing for groups like people with disabilities. Simply being on screen is just part of the equation. Here's what Dr. Pieper told Kate.
What is the nature of that representation? Are people in leading roles? Are they in strong supporting roles? How much space are they taking up when they're on screen? Is the story centered on the experiences of women, people of color, or people with disabilities, for example? And we rarely see that latter category in particular in film. And then I think you move on to some of the other qualitative attributes of storytelling. And some of this we measure. How often are women sexualized on screen? How often do we see people with disabilities in romantic relationships? How often do we see LGBTQ plus parents, right? What are the stereotypes that we continue to see?
That leads us right into our tensions. These are a series of forced choice questions that we ask to get at the heart of the discussion about thinking about the future of our topic. Because people's opinions matter, and they matter to how we shape the future, they matter to how we react to the future, and so we'd like to keep that kind of human-centric focus on the attitudes and opinions that relate to the future as we talk through the idea. Here are 5 tensions driving the future of identity. Tension 1. Our first tension is what Dr. Pieper was just talking about. Do you see yourself in the media or no? Currently, only 1 in 3 people sees themselves in popular culture. But interestingly, that number is higher for Black, Hispanic, and Asian consumers, more than half of whom feel represented in the media they watch. Perhaps equally important is the understanding of identity we get from seeing people on screen with identities we don't interact with day to day. It's with identities you are less likely to come into contact with, people from different backgrounds or different identities, that media can play a role in shaping how we see other folks with potentially greater impact, says Dr. Pieper. Tension 2 but this tension is almost certain to shift the other way as we have more and more places to express our identities in 3D virtual spaces. The tech isn't there yet, but it's not far off either. We're growing a generation that will only know a world with virtual identities as overall tech uses catch up to where we are now to some degree with gaming. Timmu Toke from Ready Player Me says he's excited to see what's going to happen when these kids start growing up and working together. Are they going to use gaming as a communication tool, a social platform? How will it change how they work together? Tension 3 revolves around the freedom to express your identity. Today, most of us feel free to express our identities, and that can be viewed as a very positive thing, especially as it's only true to slightly varying degrees among every demographic split we looked at, including sexual orientation. But we've been in a pretty liberal period in terms of legislation and court rulings, and signs point to that pendulum swinging in the other direction. If we feel less free in the future, that could have negative consequences in how we express our identities. What's most important about expressing ourselves through fashion is that, quote, that we feel true alignment with who we are internally and who we present to the world externally, says designer Leesa Evans. When we are authentic that way, it puts to bed things like feeling like a fraud or being less than, and all these inner dialogues that we don't need. Tension 4 goes back to that idea of bubbles and clustering. As we said, the surest sign that we identify with someone else is if we share the same political party, according to Ipsos research. And we know from election data that more and more people live in areas where every presidential election is a landslide. So it's not surprising that most people say they live near others like themselves. But maybe it's surprising that 42% don't. Dante Cini hopes that we don't let ourselves get too bubbled. He says, I just don't think that's what life's about. Part of being a citizen in the United States is it's kind of your job to understand that the world's bigger than you. Now, what if virtual worlds allow us to become even more bubbled than we currently are? Or what if, as NPR reported, we start to move based on our politics? And I'll note that census and other data suggest this isn't happening in significant numbers. Yet. The final tension we discuss is the matter of who we want to control the metaverse. On one hand, virtual worlds could become like our social media spaces of today, concentrated among a handful of massively dominant platforms that rule their own gardens. On the other hand, smaller platforms could proliferate where each community rules its own platform. And of course, it could be a bit of both, where platforms like Sandbox allowing users to have a role. Sebastien Bourget says, we're creating jobs for people to become moderators. It's supported by elected users of the platform to be able to report, and then to vote on the report to evaluate whether users' actions are appropriate. Now, I was around in the early days of the internet. There's a lot of the same talk you hear now, with the same sort of mishmash of hippie and libertarian ideals. And what happened, of course, is that we wound up with both. The internet spawned many of the largest corporations on Earth, but it also spawned a world with a creator economy empowered by those platforms, where anyone can have a Substack. So we'll see. Now, based on all of the data and interviews, we're going to talk through a couple of plausible ports we could land in on our journey toward the future. In one, we cluster based on our identity. So say it's 2032, and the pandemic the past decade didn't cause this huge migration that people initially thought, but accelerated that clustering that we talked about earlier from Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. People move into communities where residents share similar identities. It's how mega churches got so mega, and it's why sports bars pick a team to follow. So if we continue to cluster physically with similar people of similar identities, what does that mean? It means a walk down Main Street will tell you a lot about who lives in a place. Retailers and restaurants will develop regional concepts to mirror local preferences. The concentration of Democrats in big cities, even within red states, means that the electoral versus popular vote mismatch is even more skewed. The school board fights we're seeing now will mean that eventually the no child left behind idea gets ditched in favor of locally driven curricula that speak to values of the local community. People will use their virtual identities to explore other communities, like a cross between cosplay and Epcot tourism, and you get a similar touristy sense of those communities. Our identities become more rooted in our physical locations because they're reinforced day in and day out by being surrounded by people with similar identities. We become even less comfortable in spaces, physical or virtual, where we have to interact with people not like us. Or, what if we become less bubbled in where we live? Think about that tension point. Now, suppose it were to start to shift. Suppose we really do start to live where there are fewer people like us. Maybe only 47% instead of today's 58% say they live near people like them. Suppose, as Dante Cini suggests, that new schisms and fissures develop in areas like the exurbs or military communities and college communities, and even in our large cities. Or it's just a natural outgrowth of having a more diverse population that it becomes harder to segregate. Would we seek out communities with similar identities? Would we do that in virtual spaces too? Maybe that steers us toward a different future. Maybe now, still imagining it's 2032, that our waypoint has shifted and we're less bubbled. In this world, we express ourselves in more ways, both in our physical spaces and virtually. And that's due in part to our physical spaces becoming less bubbled as the population diversifies and population density increases. In this world, the macro trend toward urbanization continues. Density increases. Mobility, which has been on a downward slide for decades and dropped to a record low of 8.4% in 2021, continues to decrease. We inevitably wind up living with people who are not like us. But human nature doesn't lend itself to that very well. We like having things in common with our neighbors. In the meantime, the metaverse keeps growing and people find themselves spending more time with their virtual identities. They enjoy the freedom to create avatars and express different aspects of their personalities, including their aspirational goals. So one of two things happens. The metaverse centers around one or two main platforms and people congregate in that space, or it fragments, leading to the need for a Ready Player Me-like interoperable avatar. Or, of course, a little bit of both. But either way, brands realize they can now sell virtual goods and target virtual ads to you based on each of those personas. This proves a revelation, the near limitless growth as you create more goods and experience not just for you, for your work you, for your home you, for your hobby you, but for your hopeful you, for your younger self who you keep around in some worlds for nostalgic reasons, for your aspirational self, and for that amusing self you created one long weekend but grew fond of. All sorts of fun. So, what I want you to leave with is the idea that we form and express our identities is complicated and individualized. Our identities are shaped by the outside world, and that won't change in the metaverse. If anything, it'll get more so. We're likely to need some sort of tech-enabled authentication. Brands have an opportunity in the metaverse, as they do in the real world, to help people express themselves. And it's good to remember that expression isn't just what we buy, it's how we act. And brands can enable that too. And because identity is complicated in the real world, brands can help us. They can give us the tools to express the full spectrum and fluidity of how people want to be themselves. So thank you very much for joining us for the Future of Identity. Our Earth issue is actually out in print already, but that'll be our next webinar series. And our next print issue is going to be the future of food, which will lead up to our virtual food summit, which will actually be in person as well as virtual in Chicago in June. Stay tuned for more news on that. Until then, I'm Matt Carmichael saying thank you for joining us. Again, I'm the editor of What the Future, the head of the Ipsos Trends Lab. And if you need anything, if you have any questions, please reach out, matt.carmichael@ipsos.com. If you've left some questions, I will get back to you probably one-on-one. And again, When you imagine possible tomorrows, you ask better questions today. Thanks so much for joining us. You can download this issue and all the back issues of What the Future at future.ipsos.com. And that's all for today. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next month.